What do you think, or what would you say, are the top 3 things that a beginner tank probably isn't doing that would make a massive difference?
I would say the biggest one by far from what I've seen is doing weird shit. A lot of tanks, I don't know what it is, but like they come up with some of the craziest ideas.
Hello and welcome back to the Warcraft Workshop, World of Warcraft podcast that tries to make you a better player. My name is Preheat and I'm joined today with Jedith, my co-host.
Hello.
And also we have another important guest today, Dorki, who is joining us today to talk about tanking stuff.
Yo, thanks for having me on.
We have a couple questions. We're going to mainly stick with kind of like the tanking position in WoW, what you do as that role and kind of the meta of the game. But why don't you go ahead and start us off, Jedith?
Yeah, so my first question to you, Dorki, and I think this is going to be like a preference thing, but maybe you have some insight into this. Is tanking actually fun? Or are people just taking on the role of tanking out of necessity now? What do you think?
So it's funny you asked this because I was actually playing some Cata Classic that came out like a couple of weeks ago. Or actually, it's not even been that long. And tanking is such a stark difference compared to how it is nowadays. I didn't even know this because I didn't play Cata. I didn't play older versions of WoW really, and I didn't really play much tank until I would say the end of BFA is when I started to take a little bit more serious. And tanking is actually really fun now. I think tanking having a lot of self-agency is a huge part of what makes it really enjoyable. So for sure, I think a lot of people do enjoy tanking, but I will say at the same time, there are a lot of people who do it out of necessity. Like that's definitely a very true statement still. Particularly raid tanking. Like raid tanking is not as enjoyable as it is for M+. I think in M+, there's way more to do. It's way more engaging. You're actually thinking about your survivability. But at the same time, I do worry that some players might find it a little bit overbearing. And I think that's like a large reason why it's a less popular role. Even though I'm saying like, oh, it's fun and all, but I'm sure there are plenty of players who just find it to be a little bit too much.
Yeah, in my experience, like talking with tanks in my guild, I feel like that's 100% true for the raid and farm. Although I will say sometimes in progression, like the tanks may have a little bit more fun, but obviously we haven't seen progression in a while since we're in season 4, so it's a bit different. Definitely feels like it's a bit of a stale role, and whenever you're in farm and you're just kind of repeating those motions over and over again, it's not really difficult anymore. But I'd be love to hear your thoughts on threat. So, I mean, obviously you do a lot of Mythic Plus as a tank. I guess, how do you think threat could be improved? Like, do we actually still need threat? Should it exist at all? And should tanks always have the attention of the mobs whenever you're in a pull and you're pressing your buttons right?
Yeah, it's tricky because the idea of threat is that, like, if your tank is playing the rotation somewhat properly and actually tanking the pack instead of just like running around and kiting, then they should maintain threat. But sometimes this doesn't happen, and sometimes there's like the whole snap aggro where things might spawn, and like the moment they spawn, you can't really get aggro on them right away. Some specs are complete garbage at that, like Vengeance Demon Hunter, for example. Been playing a lot of Vengeance Demon Hunter the past 2 seasons because they did the meta tank, and it is a pretty awful experience when you're struggling to pick up ads that like just spawned, or you're gathering up a pole and you haven't really attacked them too much, and you're having to worry about threat. But I understand why they have threat as a mechanic still. It's a way of counteracting the whole kiting playstyle, which we saw a lot of during Legion. Legion was when it first began, when tanks had like basically 0 threat issues. You would just press a single global like Blood Boil or just like anything, and you would be able to have infinite aggro. But their way of counteracting that was to just make it so that players actually have to be engaging the pack to maintain threat. It seems like an issue that they've never really solved. On one hand, threat generally isn't an issue, but in those like very niche scenarios, like I've mentioned, with mobs just spawning or you're doing a really long gather. And what's even worse, this expansion, is the amount of cantrip items. Cantrip items make that problem so much worse. Whenever you're just gathering a pole and then, like of a Kosh procs, boom, there goes like a 200, 300k hit, and it's going to instantly rip aggro. Things like that are extremely frustrating, and I don't know how they could address that issue, but it's been an issue for a while, and it'd be nice if they addressed that particular issue of just like snap aggro.
I'll say, as someone who plays Devastation Evoker a lot in keys, so that's a class that doesn't have any sort of threat mitigation and also has a very upfront bursty profile. It definitely feels a little weird because certain classes don't even have to worry about threat, right? Like BM hunters, anyone who has like damage coming from their pets, mages to a certain extent with mirror image, priests with fade. Like there's a lot, pretty much like all the classes except for like certain melee ones. I guess certain specs of Warlock and Devastation don't really have to worry about threat really at all. But then whenever you're playing a class that has bad threat issues, you don't have a button to deal with their immunity. You really feel like there's just it's hopeless, right? Like you can wait and wait forever, and you'll still rip threat in certain cases with certain tanks, especially if you're pugging. I mean, and the quality of tanking that you're getting isn't quite there. So I understand like why I agree with you. I understand why they made this change in Legion. They also added Fervent for that reason too, right? So that you couldn't just like run away. They'll just hit random people. But I feel like maybe in classic Blizzard fashion, they might have overcorrected because it feels like a lot of tanks just have like a lot of trouble struggling to get in there and just like get some damage out and get everything pulled right away. And I'd be interested to see if in the War Within they maybe shake things up and try and like make every tank have some sort of better initial threat. Is that something that you feel like you would want to see too? Like when it comes to tanking, like what if it was, let's just throw it out there. I think this was an idea that Telegon had in our last podcast. It was like, what if whenever the tank engages with a mob, if they're the first person to hit it, they get threat equal to their health or something like that as like an additional little boost?
I'm not sure if that would fix. Like, I'm just thinking of like, you know, what are potential problems, right? Because there are definitely ways it could cause problems. Like if you have someone else tag a pack first, there are situations where you might want, say, the healer to go tag a pack, or if you accidentally face pull something, then suddenly it becomes like so much harder to pick up. So there are definitely like concerns I could see with that. Again, I still don't know what the exact solution could be. Honestly, I see it more as specific tank classes don't have the ability to appropriately pick up mobs. Like if you're looking at a bear tank generally has no problems because it's just running around pressing swipe and thrash, and it's got Thorns of Iron rolling, etc. So it's not as big of an issue for some specs. It's just when you're looking at, say, Vengeance Demon Hunter, where you don't really have much snap threat, and the only thing you really have going at all times would be like an Immo Aura, possibly. And Immo doesn't even do much. So I think those are like better solutions, but again, like I'm not entirely sure what they could do.
I've even had Immo Aura like do the opposite for me, where if I'm playing Havoc, I'm DPS, and a new set of mobs spawn, and it just so happens that my Immo Aura ticks right at that moment that those ads spawn. They're hitting me. There's nothing I can do about that. That wasn't me pressing my I-beam super early to try to get the most damage on those mobs. It was literally just roll of the dice, and that's when my Immo Aura procced. There's got to be like some middle ground between either like, I don't know, we've talked about this at length with different guests, and it's like there's all these different options of, you know, maybe adding more fervent strikes, or just making tanks do more damage to generate more threat. The only option I could think of is just like get rid of threat, so it's not an issue. Because to me personally, threat just seems like an archaic sort of element of tanking nowadays. But I don't know, maybe threat is a thing tanks enjoy thinking about.
It's definitely not something tanks enjoy thinking about, at least from my experience. Like I've never really heard any tanks say like, oh, you know, that's like a cool mechanic that you have to deal with as a tank.
Yeah,
I think it's more about like a way of giving something tanks to worry about, because like if you never had to worry about threat, right, then obviously there's gonna be a whole kiting situation, and then you would have to bring on different problems like fervents, and I don't really find fervents to be an enjoyable solution. Like fervents have always been far more annoying than threat itself, actually, because it's the players on your teams that are suffering because of you.
Yeah, I think too, like if tank damage was more important, and I'd say it's like pretty important now, but majority of the time in the key, it seems like just surviving the key seems like the most important way to time it. If they just did like more damage and they need to stay in for that reason, that might be a cool way to kind of fix it too, just because I think everyone enjoys doing more damage. But I'd be interested to hear from you. Like we obviously have had different systems in the past, like we had Vengeance. We've also had times where tanks do more damage or less damage. What is your preference when it comes to tanking and your damage output? Like, do you want to be up there with the DPS, or are you happy with where it's at? And obviously there's class balance to consider here too, but how do you feel about that?
I actually never played when Vengeance was a thing, so I never got to experience that, and Never really like I've heard great things about it, but I don't know if that's just because like, oh, it's OP, therefore it's fun or what. But I don't think like the damage I do as a tank really matters that much. Now, I mean, I do think it's important that we should be trying to min max our damage, and it should be rewarding. Because if you did no damage, then it would be like, all right, so what's the point in even trying to min max your damage when it's just gonna be a difference of like 10,000 at most. So I definitely do think there still needs to be that aspect of doing your damage well. But more importantly, I find with tanks is it's fun when you're playing a tank that has damage cooldowns. That was like something that some of the tanks lacked in the past. Whenever you're having abilities that actually impact your damage, like Wings for Prop Paladin, or Incarn for Bear Tank, or Avatar for Warrior, like those buttons feel good to press, and those are ones I think they really need to nail, especially in War Within. I mean, they've done a pretty good job with it. I know for Vengeance, for example, with Fellsguard is kind of cool because for Havoc, it's kind of whatever, I would imagine, right, Jedith?
Yep.
But for Vengeance, it's kind of cool, right? Because like your meta actually becomes a meaningful damage cooldown now, and like you pressing Fell Dev actually feels pretty good.
Correct me if I'm wrong too. I don't know if you tested it, but doesn't your cheat death also give you the benefits of going into meta, and like you get those demon surges from your cheat death as well?
I don't actually know. I haven't tried it yet, but I would imagine that's probably the case.
Yeah, it is pretty cool. You're right. It is a little lackluster for Havoc because you're just getting basically more of a talent we already have in the class tree, which is Inner Demons. In the Spec tree, Inner Demon. I wanted to move on from the threat conversation. There's very clearly a tank shortage in the game right now, right? If you're going into Group Finder, you'll spend 30, 40 minutes, maybe even longer, trying to find a tank. What can we say to people that would encourage them to take up tanking and kind of give up the easy DPS role and switch over to tanking? What are some positives for tanking?
Oh, the biggest one by far would be just having much easier access to groups, because as a DPS, the biggest struggle is you're signing up to all these groups and it's hyper competitive because, like when you're signing up to a group, if you look at a group finder, there's going to be like 20, 30 applicants. You could choose from like all these different DPS. It's like, all right, why would we pick you when we could just wait for some meta DPS or like some really high IO, high gear score DPS player? But with tanks, you have much more luxury of just like signing up to groups because of less people playing that role. I will say it's probably not as lacking as it used to be, because I do feel like there are more tanks nowadays. I feel like healers are the ones that are really lacking. I don't know how you guys feel about it, but I swear it feels like there are a lot less people trying to heal this expansion in particular than the previous ones.
Yeah, I find that with both. They're both kind of the roles that are the least rewarding, I think. Healers just take shit from everyone if things go wrong. Tanks get yelled at if they pulled the wrong thing. DPS get to sit back and, backseat game for both of them. So,
especially the AUG.
Yeah. It's always the AUG, isn't it?
We love the AUGs. Well, I mean, it's definitely one of those roles where like it can be daunting again, just because of like how much responsibility you might have. It's like, all right, because it's like, I mean, like I only started tanking because like I didn't enjoy how other tanks tanked as a DPS, and like I get it, right? Like it is frustrating when I'm playing DPS, and if the tank is just like sitting there not pulling more than one pack at a time, or if the tank is like pulling too big and the group can't handle it, but the tank's like just like chilling, piss vibing, that's also a frustrating experience. And there are definitely like a lot of frustrating experiences with how the tank runs the group, but they are kind of like the driver of the group, and it is pretty important. If you enjoy having that responsibility of just like controlling how the pacing of the group, then I would definitely recommend tanking.
So like on that topic, I mean, you obviously have a lot of responsibility going in. Mostly tanks are the people who are thinking about, routes and stuff like that. You don't really have to worry about that mainly as a DPS unless you're suggesting it to maybe your tank. But what would you say is like the biggest difference whenever you're doing Mythic Plus versus raid tanking that you notice, and which do you prefer?
So I actually don't really raid tank. Like I very rarely raid tank. Only the last time I've progged as a raid tank was like back in Mythic Jailer, when my tank got banned because he was equipping like 10 legendaries at the time, and I had to actually fill in for him tanking. But
Wait, were we in the same guild at that point?
Yeah, you weren't. Yeah, you were.
I didn't raid that tier.
Prog
Yeah, I
much,
didn't
right?
raid that
Yeah,
tier.
I remember that. You were busy with like.
I do remember
whole...
Felinator doing that. Though.
Yeah,
I do remember this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that. I remember seeing his armory link or whatever.
And,
yeah.
Okay, side note, but like everyone was like, "Don't do this, man! Like, please stop! Please don't come into the raid with this." And he still did it.
Yeah.
How did he manage to do that? What was the workaround?
So if you equip the legendary item first, like the precursor item, and then you turned it into a legendary, you could have more than one legendary on. So you just do that with every piece of gear. So you have like,
oh my god,
every piece legendary walk into the raid. Very cool stuff.
I mean, it was basically like it wasn't like an actual legendary. It was just a really high item level piece with whatever stats you want. Yeah, that was the last time I raid tanked, and well, I mean, I probably like random times where I just like raid tank here and there, but like for me, I don't find raid tank enjoyable because like raid tank to me is kind of just like being another DPS in the group with different responsibilities. You essentially play very much like a DPS with much simpler rotation, and you're not really like thinking about your job as a DPS as much. But M plus is like very different because M plus, like I've said, you're engaging with so many more aspects of tanking than just sit there, like hit your mitigation buttons and your rotation, just taunt swap. It's quite a bit different, and I think that's actually a lot of players who play tank. A lot of them probably just like focus more on M plus tanking rather than raid tanking.
I will say, as like a DPS observer in raid, the thing that to me indicates that tank is really good. Obviously, they aren't dying, they aren't wiping the raid, but the biggest thing is probably just like being consistent with movement. I would say that in the current raids, or the ones we've seen lately, it seems like the movement requirement's pretty high to be very precise. Like always stand here for this thing and then move to this spot. And it really helps the raid to progress faster if you're being consistent that way, because ranged are always going to try and pre-move or like move between their globals, right? So it's like everyone can plant and be in the right spot. And then you have the flip side where someone doesn't do that, where they just kind of remix at every pull. And it's kind of a disaster, right? It's definitely like a night and day situation. So it's funny because it's like, can you just remember the strategy? Can you always stand in the right spots? And obviously, can you like not die? Not dying is a pretty big requirement. Pretty easy too. It just a lot of people maybe fail that one. But yeah, I feel like it's way more like a clockmaker trying to make every piece fit perfectly, as opposed to like the jazz of Mythic Plus, where you're just kind of going with it and seeing how it happens. Obviously, you have a strategy still, but it's just like I feel like you can remix it a little bit more and still have good results.
I was gonna say real quick, I do feel like that is a lot of raiding nowadays. Like raiding has sort of become a lot more of that whole group movement. From what I've noticed, like in the past few years, it's definitely been gravitating more towards that, especially with fights like Tindril and Varrock.
It seems like positionals are a much bigger thing in this expansion in particular. I noticed that even in like Mythic Plus, just as an overall, like there's way more swirlies on the ground. It matters where you're standing. It matters where you move to. The tank, it might be an easier job in raid. I do think that your mistakes matter a lot more, because if you screw something up as a tank, it's essentially a wipe. There might be some ways to recover something, but in a lot of cases, the freedom that a DPS has in a raid to make some error is a lot larger for a DPS than what a tank would have. Like, biggest example I can think of is on Tindril. If your tank isn't moving the boss to the right position, or if your tank just like doesn't get to the mushroom in time, it's an instant wipe. I think that's something that kind of deters or scares people away from taking on the tank role, is that there's so much weight on your shoulders as a tank, and you have to make sure that you know what you're doing. You know the mechanics probably better than everyone else on the raid team. You've put in the time to research it. I think that extra responsibility can be kind of scary for people to take on. Is it important for a tank, if they're in a raid, or even in Mythic Plus, is it important for a tank to be comfortable to play all the different tank roles because there's so little, all the tank classes, because there's only a certain amount of tanks you can take to a raid and Mythic Plus? Like, for example, in a raid, a certain class that they might be maining, isn't the meta choice. Is it important for tanks to be flexible and, pick whatever tank class is meta in that raid tier?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting question, because I've had this discussion a lot in the past with a bunch of other smart fellows, and I'm not entirely sure about this still, because like on one hand, absolutely yes. Like it's a pretty big deal as a tank or even healer to some extent to be able to multi-spec, because it's not like you like generally with DPS in particular, you have backups, you have people who can play a specific role if you can't play that role. But with tanks, there is somewhat of an expectation for you to play whatever might be considered meta at the time, or whatever might suit your DPS comp much better. But on the other hand, I do feel like you might hinder yourself as a player if you're constantly swapping classes and you're not actually like excelling at that one class that you play, right? Like say you're an extremely good bear tank player, then like, you know, it might be best to just like dial it in and just get really, 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 really good at being a tank and being a bear tank player. But I do think it is pretty important though, like when it comes to fitting into your group. So I mean, it kind of depends on the circumstances, right? Like if you are a mythic, if you are rating mythic at a certain level, I do think there should be some requirements to be able to play every single spec. And if you are playing M plus at a pretty high level, I also think it's like somewhat expected. I mean, it depends if you're playing with a group too or not, right?
Yeah.
So it's a hard question to say. Like I would say a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think it varies a lot too, depending on what the current meta is, right? Because like right now in raid, there'll be certain mechanics where it's like you need a DK to do a grip, or only this tank can do this job without taking heals. But then on top of that, you've also got raid buffs in the current state of raid buffs in the game, where Blizzard just keeps adding more and more raid buffs to the point where now we need to have all the raid buffs, plus we need to have, you know, the token augs in the raid, and now you're down to like maybe 2 slots you can move around. So I could see a lot of variability in guilds trying to get all those buffs by maybe slotting the correct tank that has that buff. Or, you know, maybe it's, again, the DK because of the utility. But I think there's definitely, it's a good point you made about the player skill. I think there's definitely a tax that you pay whenever you play something that you aren't as familiar with. Like even if you're not necessarily a one trick, right? Like I think there's always going to be a certain diminished return you're going to have on a class that you aren't, you know, you haven't spent 100,000 hours playing at that point, if there's one that you have. So I guess it's just kind of up to every guild to decide like, what's the pros and cons of this? Is it something we can work? Does it work in strategy? And what other comp pieces do we have? But I think most guilds definitely look for someone who can do all the roles. Like that's a huge plus. So like if you're looking into getting into tanking, that's it's probably something you should look into, or at least figuring out what the meta is early on and just sticking with that. That's also a good way to do it.
Yeah, I would say at the very minimum, dabble into it and have an idea of what they're like to play.
And it's true for Mythic Plus too. I mean, if you're queuing up as a Brewmaster, you're probably not going to get as many groups as if you're a VDH, right? Just like, I think Paladins can make it work. I've seen a lot of prop Pallies doing good. But like, I mean, even myself, like if I'm making a group, just plug on Mythic Plus, I will definitely be very cautious about who I invite, trying to make sure they're the right class and they got the IO and, you know, it's someone who I can trust with my key. So
that one
I
is
think
also very tricky though, because like I do think there is like some level of when you find players who are not very good at what is currently meta. I've seen that a lot with VDH in particular. A lot of times when people just like swap over to VDH because like, oh, you know, it's OP right now, but then like they're just either dying a lot or they're like, you know, not picking up aggro and all the mobs properly. There are like a lot of nuances to how tank can be played in keys, and if you don't understand every single one of them, it could be a detriment to your group.
Yeah, the FOTM Rerollers, you got to watch out for them because it's like sometimes you get someone in there who, you know, they're just playing that class because it's meta right now, and sometimes you get a real stinker. And it's true, like sometimes you just go off the rails, you just get someone in there who isn't meta and they're just going to do insanely well, right? Because the player skill is going to be a big difference. But I think your safest bet though, like whenever you're going into it, if you were to like put it to a statistic, you're probably safer on average picking the person who is FOTM because they probably know more, and that's probably the reason why they're FOTM. Obviously, there's a lot of people who will throw that statistic off, but that's been my experience at least.
I have a funny story. I forget when it was, either season 1 or season 2, when Havoc was like, people were re-rolling Havoc because it was flavor of the month. I got called a flavor of the month re-roller. I've only played Havoc for like 5 years. Are you kidding me? You're going to call me a FOTM? Man.
Yeah, well, I should have played it before 5 years.
Yeah. Well.
Yeah, come on, man.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know.
True Havocs in there.
I don't know what I need to do. Dorki, you've been doing some pugging lately, and you've been playing a healer. So you've been playing with probably a wide range of players in terms of skill level. And what do you think, or what would you say, are the top 3 things that a beginner tank probably isn't doing that they could do that would make a massive difference?
I would say the biggest one by far from what I've seen is doing weird shit. A lot of tanks, I don't know what it is, but like they come up with some of the craziest ideas. Like they might tank some pack in like some weird corner that just like makes it impossible to heal, or make like everyone's like line of sighted. I'm not sure what causes this, but people definitely do some weird shit. Or they'd be like, fighting packs that are generally not good to fight. Like I would say you should definitely spend a little bit of time in figuring out like what exactly are banned mobs and not banned mobs. Like I think the best example is in Nelfaris. There was this route, I think there was like a bear tank doing that where he would pull almost every single hunter, the Kolashi hunters on the right side of the
You hate
dungeon.
to see it.
Yep.
You do not want, like, especially as a healer, I do not want my tank to be pulling those types of mobs. Like, try very hard to avoid specific mobs that are just like not good, unless there's like no way around it, right? Like, obviously, there are situations where it's okay. It's the path of least resistance. So I understand why they might be going that way. But sometimes when they go out of their ways to pull these types of mobs, goes to show a lack of understanding, particularly for the group. And I think, like, I get that tank is a really high responsibility role, but it's because exactly of that. Like if you don't understand what you're pulling, it's pretty problematic. I would say those are like, that's like by far the biggest thing. I mean, there are probably like a couple other points too. Like, obviously, don't die, and obviously, maybe like you want to pull either bigger or smaller depending on your group's cooldowns. But those are like a little bit too specific. But like that right there is probably the most important thing. Just like understanding what you should be pulling in dungeons and not doing weird shit.
So I already know the answer to this one, but I'm asking for the viewers. What is your resource that you use to try and see routes that you should run for that week? Like a website or something like that? Might have lost them. Dorki, you still with us?
Oh, no, I was for a second I thought you were asking the viewers. I'm like, okay.
Oh, sorry. No. I was asking a question on behalf of the viewers. Yeah.
No, yeah. I my brain broke for a second, but I don't think routing is as big of a deal of this expansion. I don't know if you guys have felt that way, but
yeah, I think it's more so about which mobs are banned. Yeah,
because like they've kind of made it a deal where it's very easy to just like W route and get count. In fact, like this was like one of the things I've talked about with one of the M+ developer guys, and they specifically aimed for that goal of like making dungeons as streamlined as possible and as straightforward as possible. So I don't think like routing is necessarily as big of a deal. Like, yeah, there used to be Dranos W routes back in good old BFA and Shadowlands, but I don't think it's as important nowadays. I think it's more about just like knowing how big your group can handle and not pulling weird shit. Like I've said, the hunters.
So to add on to that, I mean, obviously the tank dictates the pace of the dungeon, what pull size you're doing, which mobs you're pulling, that sort of stuff. What do you think about the current meta of like the responsibility you have as a tank, and would you like to see more, I guess, of that responsibility leave you in future patches, expansions, etc., or are you happy with it currently?
I feel like with VDH in particular right now, the responsibility is a little bit high because right now people are kind of expecting the tank to just like solo stop everything.
Yeah.
And it's actually gone pretty bad. Like I feel like player skill has kind of gone down a little bit just because like, nobody really thinks about interrupting or stops as much. It's just like, oh, we have Demon Hunter in the group. Just like let them figure it out. Like who cares? I'm just here trying to blast and play my game. That's like something that's like it's a topic that I've talked about a lot because there are tanks who enjoy having that extra responsibility and just like being able to lock down everything. It makes it so much better in the pugging experience. But at the same time, there are a lot of tanks who definitely do not prefer having all that power, like having all that power and responsibility. Because like when you're especially when you're trying to tank a hard pack, when you're like trying to stay alive at a high level. You see it a lot with like a bunch of tanks, right? Like I'm pretty sure I've seen now complain about this a lot from Echo. He would be complaining about like, all right, I'm tanking a hard pack, and then like Jinji's calling my like 10 stops. He's like, all right, Grip Sigil here, Silent Sigil here, Fear Sigil here, Chaos Nova. It's like, bro, I don't have any globals to be trying to live here. It's like it's such a pain.
Yeah,
I
think
let me have a break.
a lot of it too, I think, is kind of the downstream of Blizzard's decision to add 1 million mechanics to trash to try and deter people from doing bigger pulls, and then it just ends up, okay, well, what tank has the most stops, and just do a stop rotation. And I personally, I don't like this meta of the game. Like, I prefer whenever the key success is about, can we do enough damage to get to the end of the key in time and kill the bosses, right? As opposed to right now, which is like, can we survive, bring as much survival as possible, bring all the stops, just like cycle them, ignore the mechanics, do the stops, and then as long as we have something up for every big hit, we time the key easily, right? I feel like it's a symptom of like the current design that they've gone with, and I really hope that they reevaluate it in the future.
Well, yeah, and I completely agree. Like, it all comes from the Dragonflight tree. It's like, you look at the Dragonflight tree, and at first it was really cool, but then they just added so much to every single class.
Yeah.
Like, now every class just has like 2 stops, and every class has like 10 defensives. And how do the counter designers counteract that, right? It's like, all right, in order to counteract that, you now have to make mobs have double the amount of casts and double the amount of group damage. And now we're seeing the results of all of this, and it's just lots of one-shot mechanics, lots of kicks and stops required, and it's become a pretty unfun way of playing M+, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's more, it's like also the defensives too. Like, DPS just have like too many buttons now to live, and I just think that this, we're talking about tanking now, but this also has an effect on healing too, right? It means that healers, it's not so much about their own healing, it's about like doing all the little jobs and having DPS that press their button. And I feel like that could be frustrating if you're in there trying to heal people and keep people alive, and it's like kind of feel powerless to stop that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, it's super frustrating in that aspect.
So like the stops thing that you're talking about. So I have a Weakaura. We'll include it in the bio for today's UI improvement of the week. But there's this Weakaura you can get. I have it set up right now where you can set up per mob, and you basically set a rotation of stops based on your comp, and it literally tells you which one is next. And I think just like, okay, so like every group, if you're good, you probably have someone who's calling the stops. Usually it's the tank, although I feel personally that the tank shouldn't do this job just because they're probably thinking about too much other stuff. But like having it as a DPS, it's so easy because I see what the next thing in the rotation is. I'm playing Aug, so I also have upheaval to run there, so I interject if it's upheaval instead, but it's just like cycling through the kicks. It kind of automates that process and makes it a lot easier. I hate that the game is this way, but I will say that this Weakaura is insane. So if you're having trouble in your dungeons, definitely check this one out with your team. I think it'll definitely improve your play.
Is it just one Weakaura that one person has in the group?
Yeah, so you can have everyone have it if you want, and it's good to do that because you might die or like not be there, and then you can't call it. But basically, so if I have the Weakaura installed and I have it programmed, because you do have to tell it like what order and stuff, what prio, what mobs to look for stops on, then I can just see, and it literally it's like Hakili, where it tells you like what button to press next, but it's just telling you which stop to call next. So yeah, I feel like it's a ridiculous situation that we need these tools, but we've kind of been put into this corner now where it's like if you don't have something like that, you just need like a super on top of it tank, or just a group has to be communicating about stops the entire dungeon. Feels a little cringe, to be honest with you.
There was another version of that Weakaura that I think JB was developing, or he was working with somebody with to make it, like at the start of Dragonflight, where there was one person had like a main Weakaura, then everyone else in the group would have almost like receiver versions of the Weakaura. So when it was somebody's like stop up next, the sender would automatically whisper the receiver to let them know that it's their stop next, which is pretty cool because it's kind of like shot calling without actually communicating, especially if you're with pugs. But the problem with that was that everyone in the group had to have the Weakaura. So, yeah.
Probably because it displays it. It's probably like the PI macro where it'll like show the image until you press it.
Yes.
Otherwise,
exactly.
they're just getting a message.
Yeah.
This week's UI improvement of the week is the Mythic plus AoE CC rotation. So the link is in the description below. Here is the Weakaura. And as you can see, it has certain abilities that are tracked in here by default. So setting this thing up is really easy. Once you're in game, you just need to import it, obviously. And then after that, select it here. So I have Mythic plus CC rotation. I have it up here in the top left. You can obviously move it wherever you want. And then on the custom options, this is how you actually set up. So you have text to speech, so you can show that. You can have it only show when it's your turn. But obviously, if you're doing shot calling, you want to have all of it. And then down below, you have the monster configuration. So this is where you actually add it, which monsters you want this to show up on. So you need to make sure that the monster is on this list. It already has some in here, but you can obviously add your own with the plus sign. Just make sure you type out the name in whatever language your client is in. And then you can set up what sort of CCs work on it. One thing I will warn you against is like, so if you have a mob that like has an ability that doesn't get stopped by whatever you have. So like, let's say you don't have any fears, you don't have any disorients, you don't have any stuns. It won't actually show up on this mob anymore once you have those selected. So it's got to be stuff that you actually have. Obviously, if it doesn't have any available abilities, it'll just not even show up in the first place. But if you have it on cooldown, it'll still show up usually. It's a little finicky, but I think it works pretty well. And then in terms of what you actually want to use, this is going to depend on your comp. I just have a profile in here from who sent me this initially. But what you need to do is set the priority here. So the higher on the list it is, the more important it is, the higher it will be on the list. And obviously make sure that they're checked if you want them included. And then you can obviously add in whatever else you need in here. This is going to be comp dependent, so you'll probably have to change this up for whatever comp you're running. But once you have it in here, I definitely recommend putting up like the Demon Hunter stuff first. That's probably the best stuff to put at the very top of the list there. Okay, so I want to show you an example of how this looks in game. So as you can see here, whenever it's your turn, you're actually going to have like this glow on it. So right here, it's tail swipe. And then once I use this tail swipe, it's going to change then to the next one, which is Chaos Nova. You can see it right here. So I go in for the tail swipe. Now it's Chaos Nova time. Notice how it instantly swaps it as soon as you press the CC. And then once that's done, it goes to the next one. So you can call it Scream Time, Dragon's Breath's next. And then obviously it's going to be Sigil of Misery next after this Dragon's Breath. But yeah, it just flips through them and it will always update with whatever becomes available. And if you run out of CCs, it usually still shows you whatever is next. It's just going to show that there's a cooldown on it if there's like absolutely nothing available. But overall, fantastic Weakaura. Definitely recommend this one. Again, I don't like that we're in this situation, right? But it is like you got to do what you got to do, right, to get it done. And yeah, a lot of stops. You know, they decided to give Vengeance Demon Hunter infinite stops.
It is causing a problem too, though, like you were saying earlier, Dorky, where people, especially DPS, just stop worrying about their kicks and their stops because they just assume that the tank is going to get them now. So when the time comes that either Vengeance doesn't have that control or they're playing with another tank who also doesn't have that control, it's going to be a rude awakening because they're going to start dying to casts that just are going off and not getting kicked. And it's training DPS in a very bad way to not worry about that stuff anymore.
Yeah, and I wonder how it's going to go going forward too, because like I've noticed they've been like adding some stuff too in Warframe, like Blood Decay, for example, is actually getting silence on their mass grip.
Right. Do you think the answer to that is to give all of the other tank classes the same amount of control, or should they scale it back?
I would prefer if they scaled it back. I don't like this whole meta of just you guys have infinite stops and the mobs have infinite stops. That's how you play the game. I would prefer if it was just like, dialed back to like, maybe more of like Shadowlands or BFA where, okay, maybe there's, because like you guys remember back when melee interrupts were valued, back when people were like, oh, like you don't have enough melee interrupts in your group. Now it's going to be like something you're going to have to think about more. But nowadays it's like, all right, who even cares? You just play triple caster. You can even have one of the casters not even have a kick, aka priest. Yep. And it's not even a problem now because you're not as reliant on these single interrupts and single stops. You just like the game has become way more about just like doing 10 AoE stops and having all these casts stopped or otherwise you wipe.
What do you think the answer for Vengeance is? Is it like getting rid of double sigils for just the utility ones and keeping it for the damage ones?
Yeah, I would say that, but also like I don't think it's as big of a problem if Vengeance has that niche still. It's just that niche is a little bit too impactful. Right. Like I said, like I would like it if they had a little bit more emphasis back on single kicks or individual stops.
So I think we kind of got your opinion on this earlier in the podcast, but when it comes to tanking, there's a fine line that you have to try to find and a balance between your damage throughput and your survivability as a tank. Now, because tanks don't really sim themselves, because you're not just trying to optimize your damage completely. If you do that, you're going to be very squishy. So how do you find the balance between your damage throughput and your survivability?
I think it depends a lot. Generally speaking, tanks should focus more on survivability, even like especially when it comes to any type of progression content, whether it's progression raid or just doing keys in general. In particular, I would say Cheat Death Trinket. Cheat Death Trinket is far too valuable. I don't think any tank should ever use a DPS Trinket over a Cheat Death Trinket when that Cheat Death Trinket could save so much time in progression, whether it's raid prog or like M+ progging keys. The last thing you want is your tank like, oh, I accidentally died. But obviously having something like a Cheat Death would give you that safety net and let you continue on with whatever you might have fucked up on. And aside from that, I would say like damage still matters. Like I don't want that misconception of like you should only play pure defensiveness and not worry about damage at all. Like I do think there are some situations where whatever you bring for damage is like far too valuable. It just depends so much. Like say Grief Torch, for example. You know, like Grief Torch is extremely valuable in many situations. Like if you're doing Bracken Hide, being able to kill those totems is super high value. But at the same time, if you're just playing this like one damage talent that might increase your sims by like 3%, that's basically nothing on a tank. Like you doing 10k more single target can be kind of a big deal, but if it's you doing 10k more overall damage in an entire dungeon, that is like far less impactful. So
Right.
it's a hard question to answer, but I would always lean towards survivability.
Yeah, I think it really just depends on like the opportunity cost. So like you always have to consider what you're losing in that, and also classes that are more efficient with gaining damage versus survivability, right? Because there's a lot of situations where a class might give up too much to go in one direction. I mean, honestly, the same for like damage dealers, right? When it comes to like AoE versus single target, some classes are blessed to have basically everything in the same kit, like Demon Hunter and many others, but others have to specialize, you know, like Rhett. So you always have to just have that awareness to know what you're giving up to pick up whatever you're picking up.
But yeah, also in many cases, gaining defensiveness can also mean higher damage. Like
Right.
there are a lot of factors to consider. If you're tankier, that means you can face tank the pack for longer, which means you ultimately do more damage. If you're able to pull larger, both you and your group will be doing more damage. So there are like so many factors when it comes to being tankier. It could also just mean like your healer doesn't have to heal you as much, therefore your healer is doing more damage. It's not just about individual damage, which is like something that a lot of tanks don't consider. There's like huge value in just being able to sit there, tank a bunch of mobs, keep them all tightly grouped, and not have to worry about dying.
So as a tank, obviously having the awareness going into the content, knowing what you need to do ahead of time is really important. But also in the moment, having that situational and spatial awareness can be just as important, right? What would you say is the best way if someone's trying to improve their spatial awareness or situational awareness as a tank that they could go about doing that in Mythic Plus?
One of the biggest things I've noticed with a lot of players is they don't use any friendly names or like friendly nameplates, either one of them. And sometimes when I'm like either watching different tank streamers or just like watching or like reviewing some tank gameplay footage, it feels like they're super unaware of where players are. And that's like a pretty big deal. I'd say definitely try to have a UI where you can comfortably see where everyone is and just like have an idea of like what's going on with the mobs, but not one where it's like super bloated with stuff.
Yeah.
There is a very fine balance between like what you should be tracking and what you shouldn't be tracking. And some people either overtrack or some people just like aren't tracking the right things or the important things.
Yeah, I think if you have like a spaceship UI, it can also be kind of hard to see what's going on because there's just like so much crap taking up room on your screen that doesn't really need to be there too. But I agree about the names. Like I even have them as a DPS player because it's important to know where people are standing. And also if you're ever playing AUG like or a healer and you have utility to move people around, it's important you know where they're standing so you can move them to a spot that doesn't troll them.
One of the things I've seen tanks do a lot, because I've been pugging this past season, and on the final boss in Alderman, when you're fighting the dragon thing, and right, they tuck themselves back into a corner, they pull the boss back there, and there's swirlies all over the place. But because the tank isn't really looking where everyone else is standing, they just see that, oh, where they're standing is safe. They're not standing in a puddle, so that's a great place to put the boss, right? No, because no other melee player or anyone else can even get close to the boss, but they don't even realize that because they're just looking at their own feet. Where, like you said, if they have the names of their other party members visible, they might easier recognize that the rest of their party is not actually safe.
I think also it comes down to like how zoomed out you are and where your camera is too, right? Because as a tank, you always have a bunch of crap in your face. You can't really see beyond it unless you angle your camera right. You have a certain amount of zoom out, and it can be frustrating in some cases because WoW isn't the greatest game when it comes to that. You'll have a lot of trees and branches and leaves just blocking you, but I think it's really important to have that eye on the raid. I'll say, like, for me personally, the way that I think people, at least if you're going about it like you're just trying to improve as a player, be more aware. Honestly, I think being a shot caller or being like a raid leader or someone else who has some form of responsibility, that's a pretty good way to get a good idea of what's happening, because you're basically forcing yourself to pay attention to that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because, like, if I ever get into the mindset of like having out someone call, I notice that my awareness definitely diminishes a little bit. Now, I mean, I would say like a lot of times it's for the better because you definitely want your focus to be like your brain only has so much capacity to think, right? And it's much better to have that focus on what's important at the time. But it is very noticeable how much my awareness diminishes when I'm not like either tracking the kicks at all times or the stops, and I'm just like playing the game.
Yeah, so I mean, I already know your answer to this, but do you think tanks should be the people who have to do the shot calling based on that?
So, I mean, I actually have a mixed answer on this one too, because like if you're just pugging and if you are not playing with a consistent group, I do think so, yes, because I mean, I do think that is where it all stems from. A lot of it, like I think as a tank, you will succeed so much more if you're able to do shot calling for whether it's these like pug groups or these like friend groups that you play with. But if you are playing in a set group, if you're playing in a static 5, I don't think the tank should ever be the one having to do any of the shot calling, because that job could easily be allocated to a range player that has like a much better view of what's going on, because like generally speaking, as a range player, you wouldn't have as much of a camera issue. You can see a much better overview of like what's happening at the time, and there's also just generally less mechanics happening for a range, so the range can put some of their focus onto like staring at a kick tracker or stop tracker. And that's how a lot of the high level groups do it. It would have one of their DPS players doing that, while the tank can just focus entirely on surviving and doing all these other jobs.
Yeah, I think the only area where it gets a little awkward, because I agree with you 100%. I think range should be doing it, but it can be a little awkward sometimes in the pass off because the tank has to group everything up, and then they're going to do a certain amount of stops once it's grouped up to try and get everything nice and tight. And it can be weird if you don't have that communication and like comms or something to know when it's time to start the kicks versus, is the tank still doing their thing, right? Are they done at that point? So I think that really just comes down to familiarity. But yeah, I mean, as a DPS, like especially if you have like a variable cooldown on the stop, it's pretty good to have you call the stops, because then you can throw in your stop whenever you can and try to get it in there and make a efficient use of your stops, because you will eventually run out if you just kind of rip everything, and that could be lethal. So I like personally, whenever things look like there's maybe a little bit of a lull, it's like, okay, everyone throws their interrupts here, right? Just grab one. Yeah, I think it's definitely something that if you have a group of people playing, it's infinitely easier to get this figured out.
Yeah, like that's actually something I've talked about with some other players that I was playing with this week or the week before. When you're a tank and you're doing specific pulls, it helps a lot if you're communicating and just talking about like where stops are needed or not, because Like say first pull of Ruby Life Pools, you can just call to like only stop the tectonic slams until you're starting to run out of defensives where like, you know, your meta might be gone or your brand is gone. And then you can start calling for like, all right, start stopping all the bolts and, you know, put an emphasis on that. Or that's like, you know, maybe where you want to start shoving, or like you will just like shove in one of your CCs early. Like you just shove in your silence sigil. Be like, all right, I'm out of stuff here. I'm gonna drop silence, and then you guys continue your stops after. Just like having some type of back and forth helps a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of mechanics this season too that are really annoying with the stops. Like the one that comes to mind for me most is Ice Shards in Halls of Infusion. I absolutely hate it because it's like it's such a short cast, and a lot of stops are melee, and usually it's paired with a pack where there's a circle that's going to kill you if you're in melee, or a frontal that's going to kill you right next to it. And it's like in a lot of cases, like, and it just hits the tank too. So you can kind of get away in some cases with not doing it because the tank may just outplay it, or maybe they cheat. But I feel like as a tank, I would be internally screaming while those pulls are going on, like, come on, guys, please. I can't take this shard during the breath. Like, please, someone stop it. Like, and I don't understand why, if there are mechanics that we're supposed to stop, if that's the solution that Blizzard, wants for us, why make them so short where it's like you have like such a small margin of error? Or even, I mean, to expand that point further, like pulls where you have to use cheese spots. I just don't know what they're going for with the design like that. Like the guys in the first couple packs of Nakud, or other mobs that, like the hunters you mentioned before. Just not really sure what the design intent is with that. I don't know. What do you think about that? Like, do you feel like they've gone maybe overboard with some of the mob types?
What do you mean by mob types?
Like hunter, so the style of mob where it's like as the key level scales up, you're pushing. Mm-hmm. It's the hunters, it's the ice shards, it's the mobs that do the stabbing on you in Nakud. Like these kind of mobs where not unavoidable, but unavoidable unless you're cheesing something damage that's just going out constantly. You may not even experience this as a tank, to be honest with you, because it's more a range problem.
Yeah. I know exactly what you're saying, but I feel like a large part of it is they don't consider that a problem. Like they consider one of those like, all right, you're going past +10s previously, +20s. That's like something that you'll just have to figure out. And it feels like such a bad approach because they never really consider what the experience might be like for someone who is engaging in higher and higher level content, and who cares a lot about the competitive integrity of how these dungeons are played. And yeah, I mean, I really don't know why else they would do anything else about it.
So you think it's just something that they're saying, hey, deal with it, this is just a byproduct of doing a high key?
Yeah, I do think it really is, because like a lot of these problems aren't as much of a problem if you consider it in like a +10 key, right? Like I'm sure people in +10 keys, they care more about the actual big interrupts, like, the ones that actually wipe your group, not something that might do extra damage to your group. Because like ice shards or like the swift stabs and all that are not that big of a deal until you get to the higher levels.
Yeah, and once you get there, it's like, okay, well, we need a resto druid to go in flight form and stay on top of this pole, or else we're unless you can't do the pole. Which is like, okay, cool. Like, what a great experience. If you go into a dungeon like that and you don't have a resto druid who knows what they're doing in the Nakud at like a high level, it is actually the most unfun experience you will have as a ranged. Like, you will literally just chain feed. It's impossible for you to even stay alive. Because the frequency, right? Like, you can dodge the swift stab if you move at the right time. But the frequency that they're happening, it's impossible. The margin of error is also incredibly small. I don't know if like them catering for the top 1% in this case is like something that really is a priority for them at all, but obviously they have tournaments and stuff, so they have to consider it at some level.
Yeah, but it's not even about catering too. It's about not ignoring them.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, like, it's a game. You're supposed to be having fun, but sometimes it feels like you're distinctly not having fun on certain keys. So yeah, I do really
wonder what the intended gameplay is for that type of scenario.
Yeah, maybe it's just stand on the rock. Maybe that's what they really want. I doubt it though, because they seem to fix this a lot. But yeah, I think it also makes it worse too for pugs, right? Because if you're going into a group of pugs and people don't know the deal, it's like, man, you're gonna have a really bad time in that key.
It's definitely an issue that there's these little like things that either you know or you don't know. And if you know them and the whole group knows them, it's perfect. But if you get into a pug and one person knows it, the other 4 don't, it's like the one person who knows it assumes everyone else knows it, but they don't. And they go and do it, and it's not successful because you need everyone on the same page to make it work. There's one thing, actually, I just wanted to throw this in here. There's a website, I don't know if I think it's still in development. It's called Deplete.fyi. And
Can you send it in Discord?
yeah,
so
I'll
I
send
can
it to
link
you right now. So you can actually pull up the map, the mini map for each dungeon. And this is like, it's open source. So people can click on the packs of mobs or the individual mobs and leave notes for them. Okay, like avoid this mob, or this mob does a frontal, watch out for it. Or this mob will apply a bleed to you.
So I'm going to dungeons, and then I guess I
Yep.
select a dungeon here. Okay.
Correct.
And then each mob, I guess, has tips that
Yeah.
are included. I might choose a bad dungeon for this. Let's do a Halls on Fusion instead. Yeah, so yeah, I'm assuming that since this is fairly new, it's probably there probably aren't too many, but
Yeah,
there are some
I think
tips
the
in here.
ones with red dots on them.
Yeah.
So yeah, so this is all open source, so anybody can come on here and add their little tips for these. You can I've seen things where it's like, okay, this pack you want to avoid, and you can avoid it this way by jumping up on this rock and skipping past them or whatever. So yeah, I think if this website gains some traction and it gets a little bit more people contributing to it, it could be really useful for the general community.
Yeah, I think
That's
while
actually
we're
pretty
on
cool.
the topic, there's another one that's pretty great. It's called Not Even Close. So definitely a really awesome website to try and figure out if you can survive certain mechanics. I assume as a tank, it's probably very niche things that you're looking at for this, but I think it's useful for like everyone since you can tell at the key level, stamina, versatility, etc., what buffs you have, and then it'll either show you if you're red or green on certain mechanics. Now, I will tell you this: you just slot in the AUG in here, and you'll notice that a lot of green starts popping up. It's definitely really good.
Do you know if that site considers like damage variance?
So I don't know, but in my experience, this has been super accurate because
It does for some.
I'm-
Some of them have.
yeah.
See,
So I'm running
Weakaura right here.
I'm running Ward of Faceless Ire. I've been running that recently, and man, it is like pinpoint accurate. There are things that I never would have expected to be able to live with just like a Ward up, and it tells me I can live, and I'm like, all right, we ball. Let's just see what happens,
Nice.
right?
Oh.
And it works. So yeah, I've had good experience with this.
Yeah, and we'll put links to these in the description. Dorki, are there any other specific tools that you would recommend to tank players, like any specific Weakauras or add-ons, anything like that?
Nothing in particular. Honestly, it's mostly just have a nice player, have a nice UI in general, and honestly, as long as you have like the basics, MDT, Omni CD, that's good enough.
Is there some other Weakaura? I think there's like a co-tank Weakaura that you can get, right? So you can see what the other tank in your raid has in terms of stacks.
Oh yeah, those are generally like part of like the liquid packs and stuff.
Okay.
I think when it comes to approach, a lot of people will just reach out to like a streamer or something and be like, hey, can I get your UI? And that's pretty good to a certain extent. But also I've noticed that a lot of people that I talk to who are starting out, they don't even know what half the stuff does. They're just like, it's just taking up space on their screen. So I think in a lot of cases, like less is more. But obviously having the essentials is really good. I think Omni CD also is a really good one, because it may not necessarily be showing you anything about the mobs or the dungeon, but it'll show you stuff about people's cooldowns, which can be really important to know as a tank, or like what stops you have available, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely lean towards less is more. It's absolutely true that some players are over designing their UI.
All right, so as we're wrapping up here, we just want to throw in a couple extra questions, kind of fun questions, not really related to tanking, but we're going to go around to each person here, and each person can give their answer. The first question is, what is a Weakaura you wish existed but doesn't? So I'm going to answer this first. A Weakaura that I wish existed is a Weakaura where you can press another player's bloodlust for them. Because there's so many times when I'm in a pug group and the one person who has a lust just doesn't press it, or they press it at the wrong time. So I wish there was some Weakaura set up that I could just press a button or something and it presses their lust for them. So let's move on to Dorki, is there any Weakaura that you wish existed but doesn't exist?
I want one where you can show a list of all the targets that you can just like, click or mouse over. This would be super useful for multi-dotting. And in fact, they used to have something like this, I believe, and it's not allowed anymore. But God, that would make multi-dotting or like being able to like select specific targets so much better, because that's part of the aspect I hate about WoW, when there's like 50 million targets and I have a hard time selecting the right nameplate. Just wish there was like a list of them.
Yeah, so Final Fantasy has this. I was going to say the same thing, but I'll kind of adjust it a bit. So same problem, but just having better nameplates. Okay, so nameplates in the past used to be able to stack not just vertically, they used to also be able to stack horizontally. And I feel like the game was better then, and for some reason Blizzard just made a random decision like nameplates only stack in a column. So now you have basically the only adjustment you can make is like how far from the top of your screen you can nudge it down. But then you, in a big pull or like pull with a bunch of little piss mobs, like you end up just having like this huge tower of nameplates that just goes off the screen like Lashers in, Brackenhide Hollow, something like that. And it's just like really frustrating because again, it's like, a lot of classes are like target capped in some way, or they have other things that, you need to get a kick on this one mob. And it's like, if you didn't focus that mob at the start of the pull, like good luck once it's in the pull, because you're going to have to, basically put your, it's like the meme of the William Dafoe looking up. I don't know what that's even from, but it's like you're looking up at the stack of nameplates, like where can I find the one I need to click for the kick?
Yeah.
It's just terrible.
Okay, cool. All right, next question. Do you have an embarrassing, cringeworthy moment from when you first started WoW? So I'll start off with mine. I was pretty young. I don't know exactly what age, but I was in my teens, probably mid to early teens. And I got into a Naxxramas raid group, and this was during Wrath of the Lich King. So it was like the first raid in Wrath. And there was no LFR back then, so it was like an actual raid group that I got into. And I was playing a warrior tank. So this kind of goes with the episode. I was tanking, and we were fighting, what boss was it? I think it was Grobulus, where the strat was to like tank him and kite him around the perimeter of the room or something. And I think I accidentally hit my taunt button, and I ended up wiping us just by taunting, and I panicked so hard that I just like turned my computer off. And I was playing in the same room as my friend. We were like LANing in his bedroom, and he was like, "Man, what the fuck? Why did you just turn your computer off?" I was like, "I don't know, man. I pressed the wrong button." And that like scared me away from tanking for the longest time. So yeah, that's my embarrassing story. Dorki?
I'm not too sure. I don't know if there's like any moments that like really stand out. Most of it is just like, the typical noob experiences. Yeah, I don't know if I have any good stories to tell.
Okay,
honestly.
Fair enough.
So this took place when I was in a pretty high-end guild, okay? And I was playing mage, and so obviously I have bloodlust. And sometimes people would call for bloodlust, and I would be, or I would say, I think it came down to one specific poll where I got into an argument about this. They were asking for it, and I said I couldn't use it because I was global locked. It just so happened that at some point, I think it was Mists Pandaria, I added the bubble wand to my lust for God knows why. And then Blizzard ended up changing the bubble wand to make it a global. And I was so sure that lust was a global because my lust was a global. Every time I pressed bloodlust, it would be a global, right? Mm. And I got into this big argument about it because I guess lust had to be very specific in this fight. And I think I contributed to a wipe. And then it turned out that I was just completely wrong. And it actually was just the bubbles that I was blowing that caused lust to be a GCD for me. And it really blew up in my face because I was just so certain that it was a global, because to me that was true, but it turned out just to be a macro that had gone awry.
How long did it take before you decided to check your macro?
So I was determined to prove it right, and I even shared my screen and I showed them it's a global, and then they're like, wait, that doesn't make sense. And then we looked into it. We pretty much figured it out right away that there was something wrong with it. They were like, are you using a macro? Yeah. I'll look into it. Oh yeah, the wand.
That's hilarious.
Don't use bubble wand. Never use it.
Generally, just it's not a good idea to macro any toy into your abilities because you never know what Blizzard might change. And yeah, it could screw up your rotation and you wouldn't even know why. All right, next question, and the last question before we pack it in here. What is a creature comfort you keep at your desk while you game? I'll let somebody else start this one. If either of you have anything to share.
I'll start off.
You can go first.
You probably saw me like drink multiple drinks. I don't know why. I just always have like multiple drinks on my desk.
You have like
Just
multiple
can't
at once.
Yeah. Well, usually there's 3. I'll have like water and then some sort of flavored water and then like a can. I don't know why. I just always have 3 drinks at my desk. So, pull from each one, whatever I'm feeling for that sip.
Yeah.
Gotta mix it up, Gotta keep yourself on your toes.
Okay. Dorky?
I like to generally keep my desk pretty clean, but I do like having like a second mouse on my desk that I just like fiddle around with. I don't know, that's kind of random, but nothing much else.
A second mouse that's plugged in, or
I use wireless mouses, so yeah, we're both working. I mean, it's also just like a backup, right? If one of my mouses run out of batteries.
okay. Yeah, I'll go, but I'm kind of in the same boat. I don't really have anything on my desk, but I have these drawers next to my desk, and there's so many random things in here. Okay. I'm going to show you guys something that my community is going to hate that I'm showing you this. When I was young, I had a lot of, God, I can't believe I'm doing this. I had a lot of dental work done, and I had to get some teeth pulled because they had to like widen my palate or something. So I had these teeth pulled out, and they gave me the teeth to take home.
So got teeth in your drawer?
I have teeth in my drawer. I have human teeth in my drawer.
Teeth.
They're my teeth. But I've had these for like, I don't know, 15 years now. And they're actually, I'll show them on camera. Hopefully it doesn't get us demonetized or anything, because it's pretty gross. But yeah, these were pulled out of my mouth.
Wow.
Now I just keep them in this little plastic container.
Think you'll ever put them back in someday?
I was thinking about it. If the ones I have, either rot out or whatever. I saw something.
there's
I think we're going to say the same thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a new thing where they're planning to be able to regrow teeth in like the next 20 years or something.
Yeah, there's a medication you take it and allegedly it makes you grow teeth back, which is kind of crazy.
But that's kind of terrifying. It's like, how are they going to grow back? Are they going to grow back how they, like if you had dental work, are they going to grow back how they were before the dental work or like after? I don't know.
Or wisdom teeth, right? If you had to get those removed, that might be bad.
Yeah.
It could have been worse though. You could have had other people's teeth in your drawer.
I mean, I'm telling you the story that I think is the safest to tell. Who knows what the real story is?
Who knows? There might be. Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, also my cat sometimes jumps on my desk, so that's like a literal creature that comforts me. So
literal creature comfort. Have that one. Nice. Does your cat ever like step on your keyboard?
My cat is old now, so she can't really get to. I have to like help her. So yeah, not anymore. But I used to have a cat that was like a expert at jumping right on the power button, and yeah, he was always hitting that power button. Kind of like how you're talking about in the raid where you made a mistake and it shut your PC. Only it was just like an affix I had to deal with. Sometimes the PC just shut off.
Yeah,
I ended up taping like a piece of Tupperware onto the buttons so you couldn't keep pressing it.
When I logged back into the game after that, I did blame it on my cat. So
yeah, of course. Yeah, as you do.
Yes. All right. Well, I think we can wrap it up there. Yeah, great episode. Thanks for talking with us, Dorki. It was very insightful into the world of tanking. Do you have anything you want to promote?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Shout out to Potty C. That is a podcast that I do weekly with Maximum and Dreadnoughts. Just Dorki. I think I honestly don't even know. Like my Twitter might be like.
It's on the screen.
Dorki.
Yeah, Dorki Boar.
You'll figure out something.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, I was saying more so like the Potty C. Obviously, you can Google.
Oh, yeah. It is just Potty C, I think, or the Potty C or something like that. No, it's also PODDYC, not POTTY, because
it's not that kind of podcast.
Yeah, not that kind of podcast.
One last note. All the things we talked about again will be in the description. I saw someone ask in the chat just now. The Weakaura will also be in there, and we're gonna have like a little segment for it. UI improvement of the week. So,
all right,
cool.
Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next episode.